tried to think of a good suspense joke. Didn't come up with one. They've all been made. At this point, let's talk about suspense. So I'm Joe. I work on the Relay core team at Facebook. And today I'm going to talk about suspense for data fetching, based on our experience building the new Facebook.com with Relay. So I'll start by giving a quick introduction to Relay, some challenges of data fetching, and to suspense. Then I'll give an overview of the key patterns for using suspense in an application. And finally, I'll wrap up with an overview of best practices for data fetching with suspense. So first, a quick introduction. In case you're not familiar, well, at this point, hopefully you are familiar. People have talked about this in some previous talks, but just in case you missed those talks, Relay is a library for building data-driven applications with React. It allows developers to express their data dependencies declaratively via GraphQL. And the framework orchestrates fetching data and keeping the UI consistent as data changes. So we've talked about Relay before, but over the past few years, we've focused a lot more on Relay. It's used on the homepage of Facebook.com today, and it powers effectively all of the data fetching for the new Facebook.com. We also use Relay in our mobile apps that are built for features that are built with React Native. So I mentioned this not to encourage you to go out and use Relay, listen to this talk, decide for yourself, but to set some important context, which is that many React features like concurrent mode and suspense were built in close collaboration with the Relay team, as well as our web infrastructure and product teams. So these React features like concurrent mode and suspense are designed to work with other data fetching solutions. We're not locking you into using Relay. But there are many lessons from Relay that have informed the design of these features. Together with the React team, we've identified a set of best practices that we think will set the ecosystem up for success in creating great user experiences. These are patterns that library authors can use to build data fetching solutions that work with suspense, and patterns that product developers can use to just build their applications with suspense. So let's step back and look at the problem that we're actually trying to solve. And that's building a great loading experience for our app. That's really what suspense is about. Apps often need to fetch a lot of data to show to the user. And we want to strike a balance between showing information as it becomes available so the user can see something early, while not showing a janky loading experience. So consider the new Facebook.com. A traditional way to load this page might do data fetching when a component mounts. So we'll start rendering the page, some component will mount. In a use effect hook or component did mount, it will kick off a data fetch. Until that completes, it'll show a loading spinner. Then the fetch will complete, and it will show more UI that goes and fetches data, and again and again. So we informally call this the fetch on render pattern. We had a lot of discussion about what to name these patterns. I don't expect you to remember these specific names. Hopefully, just during the talk, it kind of gives you a little bit of a frame of reference for some of the different patterns. So the basic idea of this is we render, and then upon rendering, we realize, oh, we need some data. Let's go fetch it. So this can work, but as we just saw, it can lead to waterfalls, where the app makes multiple round trips to the server, and the user waits a long time to see content. So this was one of our motivations for building Relay somewhere in the ballpark of, 5, 6 years ago. Didn't used to be called Relay. Used to be a routing framework, and then it turned into a data framework. Again, motivated by this desire to fetch the data for our UI in fewer round trips. So consider implementing a component for this UI to show a single post. Rather than have the component be responsible for directly fetching the data, with Relay, we can just describe the data that it needs. So we might define a post component as follows. And I'll quickly note that this isn't production code. It's a simplified version, but the basic idea is exactly how we write components at Facebook. So with Relay, we can define the data dependencies using GraphQL. And I'm calling a use fragment hook here. So what we're seeing here is that this component, given some post, it needs the title and the body of that post. Once it has that data, it can then render it. So everything about the post is co-located, what data it needs, and how to render it, but it isn't specifying exactly how to go get this data. What that means is that we can then aggregate the data dependencies from multiple components built like this into a single query and fetch it in a single round trip to the server. So instead of multiple kind of waterfalls of loading indicators, we can then do a single round trip to the server, get all the data, show a loading spinner, and then when it's ready, show all the content. So that's a pretty reasonable user experience. It's definitely better than seeing lots of loading spinners all over the place. So we informally refer to this as the fetch then render pattern. First we fetch all the data, then we show a UI. So this lets us design the loading state. We can at least have one initial loading state that we've thought about, and then a final state that shows the entire UI. But it doesn't let us really show too much in the meantime. If you think about it, these two approaches are really extremes on a spectrum. And in practice, we really do want to we want to be able to incrementally render a UI as data becomes ready. And that's what React Suspense is about. It's about showing some of a UI without waiting for all of it to be ready. So for the new Facebook.com, we basically want a sequence like this, and I'll show it again. So we might want, for example, to show the navigation bar in yellow, followed by the left nav in pink, followed by stories in the right content in blue, finally showing feed, the feed of posts from friends and family in green. And the idea being that even if, let's say, the newsfeed were ready first, we wouldn't want to show that first because it would lead to a janky experience as other content loaded in. So now let's look at how we can achieve this type of incremental loading sequence with relay and suspense. For the purposes of the rest of the talk, I'll kind of zoom in a little bit on just the newsfeed and the composer, which is where you can write a status update. We'll start by fetching a really simple piece of data. At the top of the screen, you can see we're showing a place for the user to write a status update. We call this the composer. And on the left is the user's profile picture. So we'll need to get what the URL is for that profile picture. OK, so again, we'll define a component, composer. And here I'm calling a useQuery hook. And this hook is actually responsible for going and fetching the data for this component. And I'm using it here just to keep the example simple. In general, we'd actually call useFragment. Multiple APIs that kind of let you scale your app. But to keep it simple, we'll start with useQuery. And hopefully, you can kind of imagine what this query returns. It returns an object that has me, photo, and the URI. Given that result, I can pass the URI into an image component and render the image. So useQuery has a few responsibilities here. You'll notice that it's just returning the actual data. It's not returning something that indicates an error, loading, or error. It's just giving me the data directly. So what happens if the data isn't ready or if there's an error? Well, if useQuery isn't ready yet, if it's still pending, if it's still fetching the data, it will suspend. It will tell React, I'm not ready yet, render a fallback. If the query fails, the component will also say, OK, I'm ready now, but when it's rendered again, it will throw an error at the point that it's actually rendered. So what does that mean for using this component? Well, we'll want to render composer, but again, it might suspend, and it might throw an error. So we'll have to wrap it in a suspense component and provide a fallback. We can provide null, in which case React will just render nothing, and sometimes that's OK. But typically, we'll want to provide a fallback. Of course, it could also throw, so we'll want to wrap it in an error boundary to handle the error case. Now, the suspense and error boundary components don't have to be immediate parents of the composer. These could be anywhere above composer in the UI tree. They just have to be somewhere so that we can handle these two cases. But for simplicity, I'm just going to wrap composer directly. So let's look at the APIs that I'm using here. Suspense is a React API that specifies a fallback in case some child or any descendant suspends. Error boundary is a user-defined component. And I was supposed to change the name of that lifecycle method. It's get derived state from error. You also probably want to implement a component to catch, though, so that one too. So error boundary is a user-defined component. And the reason this isn't a built-in component like suspense is that you typically want to customize how you handle errors. So for example, you probably want to log that an error happened and some details about that error somewhere so that you know you actually have a bug in production. And what we basically recommend is implementing error boundary once and then using that everywhere in your application so you have a consistent experience for showing errors. Finally, I showed useQuery. That's an earlier version of our relay hooks APIs that fetches data, it suspends until it's ready, and throws on error. OK, so when we define our component in this way, what actually happens when we go to render it? Let's look at the loading sequence. So first, we'll download our code. Then we'll start rendering home. But we'll call useQuery, which isn't ready yet. It has to go and fetch data. So at that point, two things will happen. The useQuery will indicate to React, I'm not ready yet. So React will look up the tree, find the nearest suspense boundary, and render its fallback. So the user will see the fallback at this point. Meanwhile, useQuery has kicked off a query and is going to load the data. Finally, useQuery will complete, tell React, OK, I'm ready, try again. React will then render home, and the user will see the content. But of course, we just rendered the image tag, so the browser will then say, oh, I need to go and get that image. The browser will go and load the image, and eventually the browser will then show that image. OK, so let's look at what the user would see. That would look as follows. So first, we'll see a fallback for the composer. Next, they'll see the UI, but without the image ready. And then finally, they'll see the profile image. OK, so that's not a very interesting UI so far. Let's fetch some more data. Relay supports some features to compose data dependencies from multiple UI trees. But to keep things simple, I'm just going to do a second useQuery call to fetch newsfeed. So newsfeed component, it's basically the same setup as before. We call useQuery, again, fetching some different fields this time. I'm fetching the first two items of the user's newsfeed. And for each edge in the feed, I'm going to fetch some data, kind of keeping things simple here. And then, given that data, I'll render it. Just like Composer, this component could suspend. It might not be ready yet, because it has to go fetch the query. And of course, it could also throw an error. Now, I don't want to have to wait for newsfeed to be ready to show Composer, for example. So I'm wrapping newsfeed in its own suspense boundary. If I put Composer and newsfeed together, then we'd have to wait for both of them to be ready. Sometimes that's what you want, sometimes it isn't. So in this case, I'm adding a separate suspense boundary. So let's see what happens when we render this. Same thing, we download code, we start rendering. But this time, we're actually going to kick off two queries. Now you might wonder, how does React able to know that there's two queries here? How does that work? So when a component indicates it isn't ready yet, React doesn't just stop there and immediately go and render the nearest fallback. It continues looking at the tree to see if there might be other components that need to be fetched as well that might suspend. So in this case, because Composer and newsfeed are siblings, React is able to reach both of them and kick off both queries. If I did something like make newsfeed a child of Composer, well, in that case, React only will get to Composer, suspend, and stop, and we won't see the newsfeed query until Composer is ready. But so long as these are kind of siblings, React can actually reach both of them in parallel. OK, so we'll kick off two queries. We'll show a fallback. And as each useQuery call resolves, they will inform React, OK, this component is ready, so try it again. So for example, Composer query completes. React will render Composer. Newsfeed query completes. React renders newsfeed. So again, what does that look like to the user? Initially, they'll see two placeholders. Then Composer will resolve, again, without images. The browser is still downloading it. Then feed without images. And then images will load in whatever order they are ready. So OK, we're getting data, but that's a lot of images kind of loading in at different times. Let's wait for them. So going back to our Composer, where we were using a standard image tag, right now, image isn't integrated with suspense. And now this is something that the React team is considering adding in the future to make image automatically suspend while it waits for the image data to be ready. But that doesn't exist today. So if we wanted to actually wait for the image, we could just replace image with our own component that implements the behavior. So this would be a user-defined component. Look at the source property, load it, suspend, tell React I'm not ready yet while the image is loading, throw an error if it fails, and then once it's ready, render an image tag. I'm not going to go into the exact implementation. You can look at the suspense docs to kind of see how to implement this. With this in place, though, we get what I think is a lot nicer user experience. We see the same two placeholders as before, but now we'll see Composer resolve in full with all of its images ready. and the same for feed. So I don't know about you, but I think that's a much nicer user experience. But you might have noticed that I made an assumption earlier. So we're assuming that composer query completes first. But what if it doesn't? Or what if the composer profile photo just takes a really long time to load for some reason? In that case, we might see something like this. Oopsie, composer's not ready. Now, in this particular case, the composer has a fixed height. So it isn't too big of a problem because the UI isn't moving around. But imagine if composer had a dynamic height based on its content. When composer loaded, that would cause newsfeed to shift. So the user's already starting to read this post, and then all of a sudden it moves on the screen because some content is loaded. That's really not a great user experience. So how do we address that? So again, I put these two Suspense components as siblings because I wanted to be able to render composer without waiting for newsfeed. If I want to ensure that they load in the same order, I can wrap them in a suspense list component. And here I'm using the reveal order of forwards, which means render in the order that the user would see, or would prefer, so top down. We can also specify backwards, so bottom up, and we can also, I think if you don't specify any reveal order, then that will just wait to show everything all at once. I think, pretty sure. Double check the docs. We just use forwards, so. I mean, really, backwards? Sebastian was just having fun. So even if newsfeed is ready earlier, we'll render composer and then newsfeed. Now, if composer and newsfeed happen to be ready at about the same time, React doesn't immediately render a component as soon as it's ready. It'll actually wait a brief period of time to see if any more content might become available to try to reduce the number of independent paints to the screen. So if composer query and newsfeed are ready at about the same time, we might actually just see it go from 2 placeholders to everything on the screen right here. So to review, the API that we're using here is Suspense List. It's a React API that lets you control the order in which sibling suspense components resolve. Now, so far, we've looked at how we would load data for a single page. Next, let's look at how we can use Suspense when loading data for a new page, for page transitions or things like modals or tooltips. For example, if I click on a user's name, I'll be taken to their profile page. So let's look at how we might fetch data for this. If we still use the same pattern, if we call that same useQuery API, how will this end up getting loaded? Well, we've already looked at it. We'll have to download the code, then start rendering, then go fetch the data, and so on. What we realized is that even though we were using Relay and we were aggregating data dependencies for a UI tree, we still had that same pattern where we had to render in order to figure out what data we needed. The useQuery API was still implementing that same fetch on render pattern. The ideal middle ground, though, is to fetch the code and data in parallel and just immediately start rendering. Just whatever data we have, we'll render it, and we'll wait for whatever isn't ready. We call that render as you fetch. And again, this is not really a term that you need to remember. Really, this is what React Suspense is about. It's about rendering data for rendering a view as the data becomes available. So far, I've shown this useQuery API. But as we just saw, it doesn't make our page transitions as fast as we would like. We'll have to download the code, start rendering, and only then go fetch data. So we've actually renamed this API internally to use lazy load query to indicate to developers that this is actually doing some work lazily and it may not be what you want. And we've largely migrated to a variant of this API that supports this render as you fetch pattern, and we think works a little bit better with concurrent mode and Suspense. The idea is to decompose useQuery into 2 pieces. The first is preload query. This is an imperative API that will fetch data and give us a reference to the results, not the actual data. And the idea is that we don't want to call this during render. We want to call this in the same event handler that would trigger the display of new UI. So if a user clicks on a link and we're going to navigate to a page, that event handler where we handle the click, that's where we want to start preloading the query. If we hover over something that will open up a tooltip, it's that same hover event that triggers showing the tooltip. That's where we want to call preload query to get the data for the tooltip. The second piece is use preloaded query. it accepts the results of the preload query call, but it isn't actually doing data fetching itself. It's just looking at what the current state of that result is. Is it ready? OK, great, I'll return the data. If it's not ready, it suspends. And if that query has failed, it will throw the error. But the key is that no matter how many times we render, this hook is just looking at the state of that fetch. It isn't actually going to trigger new fetching. So it's efficient and it's predictable. So for the profile page, instead of calling useQuery, we would change to calling usePreloadedQuery, and instead of passing variables, we'd pass in a query reference that we got from somewhere. But where do we get that? So internally, we have an API that we call entry points. And we're working to make this available in open source as well. But the idea is that we want to somehow know, OK, we have some UI we want to navigate to lazily, a modal, a route. And we need the code and the data for it, and we want to fetch both of them at the same time. So an entry point kind of gives us that, a description of that. The root property is the root component that we want to show, so the profile page in this example. And this JS resource call here is our internal API for bundle splitting. So this is just giving me an object that I can use to download this code when I need it. The second piece is this getPreloadProps function that takes some parameters. So in this case, it might be the parameters for the profile route. If I had a modal, it would be some parameters for what to show inside the modal. And it returns an object that maps keys to values of things that we might want to fetch. So in this case, a query, the profile query, and we're saying basically that query reference will be a query that fetches profile query where the ID is the ID from the route. So in this case, like whose profile are we going to? So don't worry if you don't follow this exact API. It's more about the idea of the pattern. So given this definition of a code for a view and the data that it needs, and the actual parameters, we can pass that to prepare entry point function, which actually downloads the code, downloads the data, and then we can start rendering. And take that query reference, pass it to usePreloadedQuery, and render the UI. So let's look at how that affects the loading sequence. Before, we did download code, then start rendering, then start fetching. Now we can download code and data in parallel, and hopefully show a result to our users much earlier. So next, let's get a bit more technical and look at how this is implemented. So first, we'll look at implementing the useQuery API that I showed earlier. I think it's especially interesting to understand this if you're thinking about writing a library that will actually will do data fetching that works with Suspense. There's a few challenges with implementing something like useQuery in concurrent mode. And these aren't, I want to be clear, these aren't problems with concurrent mode. I think it's very easy to look at this list and say, wait a minute. This is really about, we kind of realized we're not actually doing the right pattern. We really want that render as you fetch pattern. So we tried, but the first thing is we can just suspend when we're not ready, so this is really convenient. But then we realized, a component might render multiple times before commit. It might render without ever committing. If that happens, there's no cancellation or cleanup hook. Wait a minute, maybe there's a way to identify a component uniquely, and so we can figure out if we still need its fetch or not, but nope, we don't have that either. We asked the React team, hey, can we have a cancellation and cleanup hook? And they said no. We asked them a few more times, and they said no. Future speakers note there's a gap between the thing up here, so I keep on falling. So we were kind of wondering, OK, what do we do here? It was kind of challenging to implement. We don't want to fetch too often. So if a component renders multiple times and we call useQuery again, we don't want to keep on refetching the same query. That would be slow. But if we cache that result for too long and the user comes back 10 minutes later, that data might be stale. So we have to kind of strike the balance of caching the data that we might need, but not caching it for too long. Now, we came up with a solution that works pretty well. But part of the reason that we've renamed this API is, again, it works. You can do this, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the best user experience. Again, we saw how that render as you fetch pattern lets us fetch data much earlier and then show content much earlier. It turns out The preload query and use preloaded query style API is also a lot easier for developers to understand. They want to understand, when am I going to fetch data? If they need to, like something has happened, they need to refetch. They want to know, is this actually going to refetch, or is it going to end up cached for some reason? It also makes it easier to think about how long we're going to hold on to that data. And we can do things like cancel a previous fetch. So imagine a tab component that, as I change tabs, will call preload query for that tab. Well, if I click on tab A and then click on tab B, that component knows, well, I don't need the preload query from A, and I can cancel it. I can stop doing any work associated with that fetch. If the tab component unmounts, again, it can cancel whatever it's currently fetching. It gives us a clear lifecycle for that data. And then use preloaded query doesn't have to worry about being rendered multiple times or cleanup or any of those things. It can just look at the current state of the query that it's gotten from above. If it's ready, return the data. If it's still pending, suspend. And again, this makes it a lot easier to explicitly refetch. We just call preload query again and use that new value. So it's simpler to implement, it's more predictable, and it can be more efficient. Now you might say, but that use query API, that seemed kind of convenient, right? Like it just gets data. And it is. Developer experience is certainly important, but what's really important is a great developer experience in service of a great user experience. The use query style API, where we just fetch data as we need it, it definitely makes it really easy to get started, and it can be fine for smaller applications. But if you really want to show a great user experience to users, the pattern that I've described, we think works better. So wrapping up, best practices for data fetching with Suspense. The render as you fetch pattern is about starting to load resources before rendering, and then we suspend if they aren't ready yet by the time we do render. We can use Suspense at key points in our application for staged loading. And we can use Suspense list for in-order resolution of blocks or lists or blocks of elements. Finally, we can use Suspense not just for code, not just for data, but for assets, things like images or any other content that you need to download asynchronously to render your UI. There's a few APIs I'm not covering here that support more sophisticated use cases, use transition and use deferred value. You can read about them in the docs. But before I wrap up, one more thing. Today, I'm excited to announce that we're releasing an experimental version of Relay hooks. It's the same optimized compiler and runtime that we've had for the last few years with Relay Modern, with a new hooks-based API. It's battle-tested on the new Facebook.com. It's Suspense and concurrent mode compatible out of the box. In fact, we've been designing Relay hooks in close collaboration with the React team, iteratively changing both Relay and React to make sure that we could build great experiences. So Relay hooks includes the preload query and use preloaded query APIs, as well as the use lazy load query API that I showed. So you can actually look at these APIs, look at the implementation, and see for yourself. It also includes the use fragment hook for co-locating data dependencies in your components and aggregating them, and as well as hooks for refetching data and for paginating over lists. And coming soon to open source are support for defer, stream, and data-driven dependencies, which Ashley showed yesterday. So whether you're interested in using Relay or you just are looking for a solid reference implementation of data fetching with Suspense, we encourage you to check out the code. Try it and give us feedback. Thanks.